A courtroom. A place where justice is supposed to prevail, where the powerful are held accountable, where fairness is more than just an illusion. But today, it felt like anything but. The air was thick with tension, yet the only person who seemed completely at ease was the man sitting high above the room, wearing the black robe of authority. His gavel rested lazily in his hand, his smirk growing wider with every second that passed. He had already made up his mind. This wasn't going to be a trial, it was going to be a spectacle, and he was the star of the show. "Let me stop you right there," the judge interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench, amusement dancing in his cold eyes. "You really think you're about to walk into my courtroom and tell me how the law works?" A chuckle escaped his lips, a low, mocking sound that echoed through the chamber. "You must be out of your damn mind." She didn't respond immediately. Her hands gripped the edges of the wooden podium, her knuckles turning white, but her expression remained unreadable. She had spent years perfecting the art of control, of swallowing down the anger that burned inside her when men like him sat on thrones they didn't deserve. She had faced oppression in its ugliest forms. But this? This was something different. This was a man who thought he was untouchable, a man who believed his position gave him the right to humiliate whoever he pleased. "I have every right to stand here and demand justice," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. The judge scoffed, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "Justice? Oh, sweetheart, let me explain something to you. Justice is whatever I say it is. And right now, I'm not interested in your little sob story. This case. This nonsense about racial discrimination. Dismissed. Overruled. Get out of my courtroom before I hold you in contempt." A wave of laughter rippled through the audience behind her. The attorneys at the opposing table smirked. The stenographer didn't even bother to hide her amusement. It was as if they had all been waiting for this moment, for the judge to put her in her place, to remind her that in rooms like these, power did not belong to people like her. She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to stay still, to remain calm. But inside, something in her cracked. She had come into this room thinking she could reason with a man like him, that the truth alone would be enough. But that wasn't how the world worked, was it? This man, this arrogant, corrupt excuse for a judge, had already decided her fate the moment she stepped through those courtroom doors. He saw her skin, her confidence, the way she held herself, and he had made a choice, to make an example out of her. "Nothing to say now?" the judge taunted, his grin widening. "I figured. You people are all the same. You come in here thinking you can bend the law to your will, thinking you deserve something you haven't earned. But the truth is, you're just another loudmouth looking for a handout." A quiet settled over the room. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, soaking into the walls, seeping into every ear that had just heard them. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She didn't even blink. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him as if seeing him for the first time. And then, ever so slowly, she smiled. A small, knowing smile. A smile that sent a chill down the judge's spine before he even understood why. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defeated. No, there was something else there, something he hadn't expected. A quiet certainty. A promise. Because what the judge didn't know, what no one in this room knew, was that the woman standing before him wasn't just another attorney, wasn't just another black woman he could silence with the swing of his gavel. She was the chief of operations for the CIA. And if there was one thing she knew how to do, it was take down corrupt men who thought they were untouchable. He thought this day was the end of the case. What he didn't realize was that this day was the beginning of the end, for him. His face would be on every news channel. His name would be dragged through the dirt. The very people who laughed at her today would watch in horror as the empire he built collapsed around him. Because justice? Real justice? It was coming for him. And he never even saw it coming. Hey family, before we dive into today's story, let's get one thing straight: Plow of Twist stands against racism in every form. This channel is about powerful stories, justice, and turning the tables on those who underestimate us. To every black viewer watching, you are seen, you are valued, and your voice matters. Now, get ready for a story of disrespect, power, and a twist that nobody saw coming. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story that leaves you speechless. Enjoy the story. Let's go. The morning sun barely filtered through the thick gray clouds over Atlanta, casting a muted glow over the city streets. It was a typical Monday, too early, too cold, too rushed. People moved with purpose, bundled in their coats, faces buried in phones, navigating sidewalks with the kind of detachment that only big cities seem to cultivate. Somewhere in the heart of it all, towering over the constant hum of honking cars and distant sirens, was the Fulton County Courthouse, an imposing structure of glass and concrete, designed to command respect. Inside, however, it was a different story. Aaliyah Carter walked through the courthouse halls with a steady stride, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors, the weight of the case files in her arms a familiar burden. At 39 years old, she was a woman accustomed to walking into rooms where she wasn't wanted, where her presence alone was enough to shift the energy, to make certain people sit up straighter, others avert their eyes. She was used to the silence that followed when she entered a space, a silence thick with assumptions, doubt, resentment. It never fazed her. It had never stopped her before, and it wouldn't stop her today. Dressed in an immaculately tailored black suit, her dark brown skin glowing under the courthouse lights, Aaliyah exuded a level of confidence that had been hard-earned. She wasn't just a woman who spoke well, she was the kind of woman who made people listen. It was in her voice, her posture, the way she carried herself with an authority that didn't require permission. She wasn't just another attorney. She had built her career on exposing corruption, on fighting for those who had been silenced. She had worked cases that others deemed impossible, torn down systems built to keep people like her in check. But this case was personal. She adjusted the strap of her leather bag on her shoulder, inhaling sharply as she approached courtroom 12B. Just beyond those wooden double doors, a man in his 60s, with thinning silver hair and piercing blue eyes, waited for her. Judge Howard Reynolds. A man who had spent decades on the bench, sitting at the highest seat in the room, passing judgment with a casualness that was both chilling and infuriating. A man who had never faced a consequence in his entire career. Reynolds had been a fixture in Georgia's judicial system for over 30 years, known for his sharp tongue, his impatience for cases he considered beneath him, and his tendency to dismiss discrimination lawsuits without a second glance. He was a man who had built his legacy on maintaining the status quo, a judge who wielded his power like a weapon, cutting down anyone who dared challenge him. Aaliyah had seen the statistics. Over the last decade, Judge Reynolds had ruled against racial discrimination cases nearly 85% of the time. No matter how damning the evidence, no matter how clear the injustices, he always seemed to find a way to justify the unjustifiable. To him, racism in the workplace wasn't real. To him, black professionals weren't being overlooked, they just lacked the qualifications. To him, every lawsuit brought to his courtroom was nothing more than a waste of time, a desperate attempt to play victim in a world that, in his eyes, offered equal opportunity to all. And today, she was about to stand before him and prove him wrong. The case involved Nathaniel Porter, a black man in his mid-40s, who had worked tirelessly for over 2 decades at one of Atlanta's most prestigious law firms. He had started as an intern, climbed the ranks, put in the extra hours, won cases that had made the firm millions. And yet, when the time came to promote a new senior partner, the position was handed to a less experienced white associate. Nathaniel hadn't just been overlooked, he had been set up to fail. His superiors had deliberately given him cases meant to be lost, had excluded him from key meetings, had documented fabricated complaints about his performance to build a case against him. And when he finally filed a complaint, he was swiftly terminated. A textbook case of workplace discrimination. A case that, under any fair judicial system, should have been an easy win. But this was Reynolds' courtroom. And Aaliyah knew exactly how this would play out. He would smirk, shake his head, wave his hand dismissively, and strip Nathaniel of any chance of justice before the trial even truly began. She stepped into the courtroom. The murmurs of conversation faded. Eyes turned toward her, some curious, some indifferent, some hostile. The air was heavy with expectation. She had been in this exact position before, but something about today felt different. More charged. More volatile. She moved to her table, setting down her files with precision, barely glancing at the opposing counsel, who barely even acknowledged her. Men in expensive suits, smug and unbothered, already certain of their victory. Across the room, Nathaniel sat stiffly in his chair, his hands clasped together, his face impassive but his eyes flickering with an emotion she recognized all too well, the quiet, simmering anger of a man who had been wronged one too many times. Then, Judge Reynolds entered. All rise. The room obeyed, standing as the old man strode toward his seat, his black robe flowing around him like a cloak of invulnerability. He took his time settling in, flipping through a few papers, barely glancing at the plaintiff's side before speaking. Well, Reynolds drawled, peering over his glasses. Let's get this over with. Aaliyah met his gaze head-on, refusing to be the first to look away. She could already feel it, the weight of what was about to happen. The unfairness of it all. The sickening certainty that no matter how solid her arguments were, no matter how damning the evidence, Reynolds had already made his decision. And yet, she remained standing, unwavering. Because what Reynolds didn't know, what no one in this courtroom knew, was that Aaliyah Carter wasn't just here to win a case. She was here to end him. The courtroom felt colder now. Not physically, the air conditioning hummed at a steady, neutral temperature, but the energy had shifted. The smirks, the whispers, the subtle glances of amusement exchanged among the opposing counsel, they had all faded into something else. Something heavier. Something close to discomfort. Aaliyah sat motionless, fingers laced together, her expression unreadable as she listened to Judge Howard Reynolds dictate the fate of her case with the same indifference he might use to dismiss a parking ticket. She had expected arrogance. She had expected bias. But this? This was something else entirely. The court finds no substantial evidence to support the claims presented, Reynolds announced, flipping through the case files as if the words inside them weren't attached to real people, real lives. His voice was slow, deliberate, drenched in condescension. Furthermore, the plaintiff has failed to prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that discrimination played a role in his termination. Without clear and irrefutable proof, this court cannot, in good conscience, allow this baseless claim to proceed. Therefore, he paused, giving Aaliyah a look so smug it made her hands tighten into fists beneath the table. This case is dismissed. The words landed like a slap. The room stayed eerily silent for half a beat before a low murmur rippled through the crowd. Nathaniel Porter, who had sat through the entire trial with a quiet, simmering tension, let out a slow, disbelieving breath beside her. His shoulders, once squared with hope, sagged as reality sank in. It was over. Just like that. Aaliyah didn't move. Didn't blink. The words, "case dismissed," didn't shock her. But what came next? That was where Reynolds made his mistake. He leaned forward, setting his gavel down just slightly before speaking again. "Miss Carter," he said, and the way he said her name sent something sharp crawling up her spine. "I'd like to offer you some advice." Her jaw tensed. She didn't respond. "I don't know where you got the idea that you could walk into my courtroom and waste this court's time with this nonsense. But let me be clear," he folded his hands over his desk, his silver blue eyes pinning her in place. "You are a talented woman. There's no denying that. But talent alone does not change the rules of reality. Perhaps, if you spent less time chasing fairy tales of oppression, you might find yourself on the right side of the law more often. Silence. A brutal, thick silence. The words hung in the air like poison, seeping into the walls, into the breaths of every person in the room. Someone in the gallery coughed. Another shifted uncomfortably in their seat. The opposing attorneys, once smug and arrogant, no longer laughed. Aaliyah stayed utterly still. Her heart was steady. Her face remained unreadable. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, as if expecting a reaction from her and finding himself bored when he didn't get one. That will be all. He reached for his gavel. Aaliyah's voice cut through the tension before he could strike it. So, that's how it is. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. A conclusion. A judge, a man entrusted with the power to uphold justice, had just, in front of a full courtroom, dismissed not just a case, but the very concept of systemic racism with a casual wave of his hand. Reynolds lifted an unimpressed brow. "Excuse me." Aaliyah stood, smoothing the front of her suit with deliberate slowness, her movements careful, precise. She was making sure she would remember this moment. "I said," she continued, stepping back from the table, her voice even, measured. "That's how it is." There was something undeniable in the way she looked at him then. Something controlled. Calculated. Not anger, not defeat, something else. And for the briefest flicker of a second, something in Reynolds' expression changed. It was small. Barely there. But it was real. A sliver of unease. Aaliyah turned to Nathaniel, her voice softer when she spoke. "Let's go." Nathaniel, still tense, still stiff with barely restrained fury, hesitated. But he nodded, pushing himself up from the table. The moment they moved, the tension in the courtroom seemed to snap. Conversation sparked again in hushed voices. Spectators began to shift, murmurs swirling around them like a storm on the verge of breaking. And Reynolds? Reynolds watched her go. Watched as Aaliyah Carter walked out of his courtroom with her back straight, her head high, and a certainty in her step that made the gavel in his hand feel heavier than it had a moment before. He should have let it end there. He should have let her leave. But his own arrogance wouldn't let him. "Miss Carter," he called, just as she reached the doors. She stopped. Turned. Reynolds smirked. The tension in the room tightened like a noose. "I'll give you one thing," he mused, tapping his gavel lightly against his desk, his tone dripping with amusement. "You've got a fire in you. A real determination. I respect that." He leaned back. "But you should know something. This world. It's never been fair. And it never will be." A small, smug shrug. "And no amount of grandstanding will ever change that." A beat. A long, dangerous beat. Then, Aaliyah Carter smiled. A slow, knowing, calmly terrifying smile. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just looked at him. And for the first time since taking the bench that morning, Howard Reynolds felt something sharp and unfamiliar coil in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. A sliver of doubt. Aaliyah turned. And this time, she walked out without another word. Nathaniel followed, his confusion barely masked as he matched her pace. When they stepped out into the hallway, away from prying eyes, he finally let out a breath. "That's it?" His voice was sharp, incredulous. "We just leave? Just like that?" Aaliyah glanced at him, but her expression was unreadable. "Nathaniel," she said quietly, slipping her phone from her pocket, unlocking the screen with a swift tap of her thumb. He frowned, glancing down as she opened a folder on her device. A folder labeled classified. A folder filled with files. Names. Documents. Accounts. A folder with one name highlighted in bold. Howard Reynolds. Aaliyah exhaled slowly, the weight of what came next pressing against her ribs. She looked up, eyes sharp. Focused. Unshakable. "I never leave empty-handed." Nathaniel blinked. Then, understood. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning light cut through the large windows of Judge Howard Reynolds' office, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk cluttered with case files, legal briefs, and an untouched cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The courthouse was still waking up, the murmur of voices and distant footsteps seeping through the heavy wooden door. Inside, however, the air was thick. Heavy. A tension that had no sound but was palpable, lingering like an unseen force. Reynolds sat behind his desk, shifting in his leather chair with a sense of growing unease. His fingers tapped absently against the armrest, his usual confidence dulled by something he couldn't quite put his finger on. There had been a shift, something just beneath the surface that he hadn't been able to shake since that moment in the courtroom. Since Aaliyah Carter had looked at him like she already knew how this was going to end. That damn smile. That calmness. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He straightened, clearing his throat, forcing himself to settle back into his usual demeanor. "Come in." The door opened smoothly, and there she was. Aaliyah Carter stepped inside like she belonged there, her every movement deliberate, every detail meticulously in place. The same tailored black suit. The same unwavering stare. The same unsettling quietness that made the air feel thinner. Reynolds sat up, his brow lifting. "Miss Carter. I have to say, I wasn't expecting to see you so soon." He gestured lazily to the chair across from him. "Come to plead your case one last time? I'd hate to see all that passion go to waste." Aaliyah didn't sit. Instead, she closed the door behind her and locked it. The click of the lock echoed in the silence, and for the first time, Reynolds felt it. A shift. A turn in the tide. A flicker of something in the air that set his instincts on edge. Aaliyah let the moment stretch just long enough before she reached into her bag and placed a single folder on his desk. A thick, nondescript manila folder, its contents neatly stacked, carefully curated. His gaze flickered to it. Then back to her. He scoffed. "What's this supposed to be?" Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You tell me." Reynolds exhaled sharply, rolling his eyes as he reached for the folder. But when he flipped it open, the blood drained from his face. Inside were documents, names, transactions. Bank records. Correspondence. Photographs of him in places he shouldn't have been, with people he shouldn't have been meeting. A paper trail so damning, so undeniably incriminating, that his hands started to shake before he could stop them. His mouth went dry. "Where the hell did you get this?" Aaliyah's expression didn't change. "The same place you've been hiding your skeletons for the last 20 years. She leaned forward slightly. "Every wire transfer. Every off-the-record conversation. Every case you've tampered with. Every bribe you've accepted. Every favor you've granted to the people who made you feel untouchable." Reynolds felt his heartbeat hammer against his ribs. His fingers twitched, his mind racing. This wasn't possible. "This is," he swallowed, forcing a smirk onto his face, though it wavered at the edges. "This is nonsense. Fabricated. You think a few pieces of paper are going to scare me? That I'm just going to roll over because you..." Aaliyah slid another document toward him. This time, a signed affidavit from one of his own associates. Reynolds' breath hitched. Aaliyah spoke, her voice quiet but razor-sharp. "You've been under investigation for months, Judge Reynolds. Long before you decided to humiliate me in your courtroom. Long before you smirked and dismissed justice like it was your own personal playground. You thought your connections made you invincible. You thought no one could touch you." She exhaled, shaking her head. "But you were wrong. He stared at the papers, the weight of them pressing down on his chest. He could feel the walls closing in, feel the years of untouchable arrogance unraveling thread by thread. Slowly, he lifted his gaze. "What do you want?" Aaliyah studied him. She could see the wheels turning, the desperate calculations flashing behind his eyes. He was already searching for an escape, for a way to wiggle out, just like he always had. But there was no way out. Not this time. "I don't want anything," she said simply. "This isn't a negotiation. This isn't a plea bargain. This is just a courtesy." She nodded toward the folder. "Because in about 2 hours, that exact file is going to be sitting on the desks of federal prosecutors. The press will have it by noon. And by tomorrow, you won't be sitting behind that desk, you'll be sitting in a cell." Reynolds' face darkened. Panic laced with rage. He stood abruptly, hands slamming against the desk. "You think you can do this to me? You think you can walk in here and..." Aaliyah didn't flinch. "You already did it to yourself." The words landed like a final gavel strike. The reality of it sank in. He stumbled back a step, his breath coming quicker, the weight of decades of corruption collapsing in on him all at once. Aaliyah leaned in slightly, her voice lowering just enough to make the words settle deep in his bones. "I told you," she murmured, her tone unreadable. "I never leave empty-handed." Reynolds stared at her, his world falling apart around him. And for the first time in his entire career, Judge Howard Reynolds felt what it was like to be on the losing side of justice. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Howard Reynolds stood frozen, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as if the polished wood beneath his fingers could somehow ground him, anchor him back to the world where he was in control. The world where his name carried weight, where his title commanded fear, where the stroke of his pen dictated the fates of others. But that world was gone now, crumbling before his eyes. Aaliyah Carter didn't move. She just watched him, her presence alone a force that filled every inch of the room. She saw it happen in real time, the dawning realization, the panic creeping up his spine, the desperate attempt to pretend like he could still fix this. He had spent his entire life untouchable. He had never imagined a day where the walls would close in on him. And yet, here they were. His voice came out strained, rough, barely a whisper, but it carried all the weight of a man who knew he had no options left. "This doesn't have to go this way." Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, studying him. "No." "Then tell me, Howard, how exactly should it go?" His jaw clenched. The use of his first name landed like a slap, stripping away the illusion of his authority, reducing him from a judge to just another desperate man in a suit grasping for a lifeline. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to fix his expression, to mold his panic into something closer to negotiation. "We can figure something out," he tried again, voice leveling out, though his pulse still thundered in his throat. "You don't need to go public with this. There's always another way. You're a smart woman, Carter, you wouldn't have come here unless you wanted to talk before making a move. So let's talk." Aaliyah's lips curled at the edges, not quite a smirk, not quite amusement, something colder, something heavier. "Talk?" she repeated, as if tasting the word. "Is that what you were doing in that courtroom? When you mocked me, humiliated me, dismissed my client's case like it was nothing more than a joke? Was that your version of talking?" Reynolds' fingers twitched, but he had no comeback. Aaliyah exhaled, slow, deliberate. "You don't get to rewrite the rules now that they don't favor you, Howard. You've spent decades playing God with people's lives, treating justice like it was something you could bend and break at will. Did you really think that would last forever?" His nostrils flared, frustration bleeding into his panic, a man accustomed to winning now realizing he had already lost. "You think you're any better than me?" he snapped, his voice finally cracking under the weight of his unraveling world. "You think you're some righteous force of justice? You're just like the rest of them, power-hungry, arrogant, willing to burn everything down just to prove a point. You didn't come here to do the right thing. You came here to take me down because I bruised your damn ego. Aaliyah didn't react, not in the way he wanted. She didn't flinch, didn't rise to the bait, didn't let his words scratch beneath her skin. Instead, she let them sit there, let them linger in the space between them, and then she did something that made his stomach drop straight through the floor. She laughed. A soft, knowing, utterly merciless laugh. "Do you hear yourself?" she asked, shaking her head as if she almost pitied him. "You're scrambling. Reaching for anything you can grab onto. But let's get something straight, Howard, I didn't come here because of my ego. I came here because of justice. A concept I know you've never truly understood." She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping just enough to send a chill down his spine. "I didn't take you down. You did this to yourself." Reynolds swallowed hard, his mind spiraling through the possibilities, the rapidly shrinking exits. "I have connections," he tried, his voice hoarse. "You think I don't? You think this is just going to play out cleanly for you? If you go public with this, you're making enemies, Carter, powerful ones." Aaliyah's gaze didn't waver. If anything, her smile grew colder. "Howard." She let his name settle between them, her tone almost patronizing. "Do you think the CIA plays a game it hasn't already won?" The blood drained from his face. She let that moment sink in. Let the weight of it settle in his bones. "You were never untouchable," she continued, her voice deceptively soft now. "You were just overlooked. Not important enough to deal with. But then you made a mistake, you let yourself believe that your power was absolute. That you could say whatever you wanted, do whatever you wanted, and there would never be a price to pay." She straightened, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer like this was nothing more than routine. "Turns out, you were just another name waiting to be checked off the list." Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came out. He knew it. This was real. This was the end. She watched the realization fully settle in. Watched as the weight of decades of unchecked corruption came crashing down all at once, crushing him under the magnitude of his own sins. A shaky breath escaped him, and he finally did what he had never done in his life. He looked at a black woman in a position of power and understood that she had the ability to destroy him. Desperation clung to him now, his last fragments of arrogance fracturing at the edges. "What do you want?" he whispered, voice barely there. Aaliyah didn't even blink. "I already told you." And this time, she turned to leave. Reynolds' breath hitched. "Wait," she didn't stop. He shot up from his chair, panic gripping him like a vice. "Aaliyah." She still didn't stop. The door opened, and just before she stepped through, she finally granted him one last glance. "You were right about one thing," she said, her voice steady, unshaken. "The world has never been fair." She paused, eyes locked onto his, the final nail in his coffin waiting in her next words. "But that doesn't mean people like me will ever stop fighting to change that." And then, just like that, she was gone. The door clicked shut behind her, and Howard Reynolds was left standing in the ruins of the empire he thought would last forever. The hallway outside Judge Reynolds' office was silent, but not in the way it had been when Aaliyah Carter first entered the courthouse that morning. This was a different kind of silence, one filled with tension, with the weight of something irreversible settling into the walls. It clung to the air, thick and unmoving, as if the entire building itself knew that something had just shifted, something that could never be undone. Aaliyah walked with the same steady confidence she had carried when she arrived, but there was a new energy in her steps now. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just certainty. Certainty that Howard Reynolds' days of unchecked power were over. That, by the time the sun set, the headlines would read his name in bold, splashed across every major network, his reputation shattered beyond repair. She reached the main doors of the courthouse, stepping into the crisp afternoon air, the sky stretching wide above Atlanta's skyline. She could already hear the distant hum of the press gathering, the storm she had set into motion beginning to take shape. It wouldn't be long now. Soon, they would all know. Nathaniel Porter was waiting outside, his hands in his coat pockets, his stance tense. The last time she had seen him, he had been humiliated, robbed of the justice he deserved by a system that had never been built for men like him. But now, as he turned toward her, there was something different in his eyes. "You did it." His voice was quiet, edged with disbelief. Aaliyah exhaled, her gaze meeting his. "He did it to himself." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, then let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "I don't even know how to process this. I spent years thinking men like him were untouchable." He hesitated. "But you didn't just fight back. You made sure he never does this to anyone again." Aaliyah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the courthouse entrance, the weight of everything settling into her bones. She had been fighting battles like this for most of her career, tearing at the foundations of a system that had been rigged from the start. But this? This was different. This wasn't just another case. Nathaniel shifted beside her, his voice quieter now. "So what happens next?" Aaliyah looked back at him. She knew what he was really asking. He wasn't talking about the media firestorm, about Reynolds' inevitable downfall. He was asking about the aftermath. The consequences. The cost of bringing a man like that down. Her gaze was steady. "That depends on how far he's willing to fall." Inside the courthouse, Howard Reynolds was drowning. He stood frozen in his office, the file still spread open on his desk, the walls of his once impenetrable world closing in on him. His breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. The weight of what had just happened, of what had been set into motion, was crashing down on him, suffocating him. He reached for his phone with shaking hands. He needed to call someone. A contact, an ally, someone who could pull him out of this. But as his fingers hovered over the screen, the reality slammed into him with full force. There was no one left to call. For years, he had built his power on fear, on favors, on carefully curated corruption. He had ensured that no one could touch him, but that also meant no one would save him. The very people he had once manipulated, the ones who had profited from his rulings, would cut him loose without a second thought now that he was exposed. A cold, sick feeling settled in his gut. He turned toward the large window overlooking the city, his reflection staring back at him. For the first time, he saw himself as the world was about to see him. Not a judge. Not a man of power. Just another corrupt official, disgraced and discarded. He squeezed his eyes shut. Maybe there was still a way out. Maybe, the sharp buzzing of his office phone jolted him. His breath caught in his throat as he reached for it, his pulse thundering. He hesitated. Then answered. A voice on the other end, cold, professional, devastatingly final. "Judge Reynolds, this is the Judicial Ethics Commission. We need you to come in immediately for questioning." His fingers tightened around the phone. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. It was happening. It was already happening. He swallowed, forcing his voice to remain level. "I see." The voice continued, unbothered by the tension in his tone. "Additionally, you should expect a visit from federal agents later this evening regarding the financial discrepancies uncovered in your records. I'd advise you to prepare legal counsel." His grip slackened. Federal agents. His breath hitched. A knock at his office door cut through the moment. His blood ran cold. The call was still active, but the voice on the other end paused, then continued as if already knowing what was unfolding. "They're here." Reynolds turned slowly, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. The knock came again, firmer this time. He didn't move. Didn't breathe. Another knock. Then, the door creaked open, and two men in dark suits stepped inside. His pulse dropped into his stomach. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. One of them reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a warrant. The other spoke, his voice calm but absolute. "Howard Reynolds, you're under investigation for judicial misconduct, bribery, and conspiracy to obstruct justice." The world tilted. The room closed in. Everything he had built, everything he had once controlled, gone. He barely registered his own voice when he spoke, his throat tight, dry, shaking. "I need to make a call." The agent's gaze was unmoved. "No, Judge. You need to come with us." Aaliyah Carter stood in her office later that evening, watching the news unfold in real time. The headlines rolled in, one after another, a relentless wave of justice crashing down. Breaking: Judge Howard Reynolds under investigation for corruption and bribery scandal, federal indictment expected, judicial system rocked by shocking revelations. Her phone vibrated on her desk. She glanced at the screen, an unknown number. She let it ring. She already knew who it was. She already knew what they wanted. And she already knew this was just the beginning. The holding cell was small, cold, and suffocating in a way Howard Reynolds had never experienced before. The fluorescent lights above hummed, flickering slightly, casting a dull, sickly glow over the gray walls and the metal bench where he sat. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and something else, the unmistakable staleness of desperation. His expensive suit, once a symbol of authority, felt stiff and foreign against his skin. The weight of the handcuffs, now unshackled but having left red indentations around his wrists, burned like a brand. The sounds of the police station around him were distant, phones ringing, low murmurs of officers speaking in clipped tones, the occasional shuffle of paperwork. But it all blurred together, drowned out by the only thing that truly mattered now. The end of everything. His mind raced through the events of the last few hours, but no matter how many times he tried to make sense of it, the outcome never changed. He had been taken from his office in front of his clerks and staff, his reputation obliterated in real time as the whispers spread through the courthouse. He had seen their faces, some shocked, some amused, some silently vindicated. They had all known, or at least suspected, what he was. But now, they had proof. The federal agents hadn't wasted time. They had laid out the charges one by one, each word striking like a hammer against his chest. Judicial misconduct. Bribery. Obstruction of justice. Wire fraud. Every lie, every payoff, every case he had manipulated, all of it was coming back to crush him under its weight. And then came the part that made his stomach churn. The detail that made him understand just how deeply he had underestimated Aaliyah Carter. The CIA had been watching him for over a year. That knowledge settled in his bones like ice. The very people he had once dismissed as nuisances, the same cases he had thrown out of his courtroom with laughter and arrogance, those were the same people who had been building the walls around him, brick by brick, until there was no escape. The door to the holding cell creaked open, snapping him back into the present. The officer didn't say a word, just gestured for him to follow. He swallowed hard, pushing himself up on unsteady legs, and stepped out. They led him through the corridors, past uniformed officers who barely spared him a glance. A few whispered to each other, their voices low but not low enough. He caught fragments. "That's him. Judge Reynolds. No way. Corrupt bastard finally got what was coming to him." The humiliation sat heavy in his chest, pressing against his ribs with every step. He had once commanded respect in every room he entered. Now, he was nothing more than a headline waiting to drop. Then, he saw her. Aaliyah Carter stood just outside an interrogation room, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. The sharp lines of her tailored suit, the quiet but undeniable power in her stance, it was the same presence that had unsettled him in the courtroom, the same presence that now had the power to dismantle everything he once was. The officer motioned for him to enter the room, and he did so without a word. The door clicked shut behind him, the small space feeling even smaller with Aaliyah standing across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she pulled out a chair and sat. Reynolds hesitated, then did the same, his hands clasping together on the cold metal table between them. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then Aaliyah exhaled, shaking her head slightly as if studying him with newfound interest. "You look tired, Howard." Her voice was calm, controlled. Not mocking, just observing. His jaw clenched. "Is this supposed to be satisfying for you?" She leaned back slightly, tilting her head. "Should it be?" He scoffed, shaking his head, though the bitterness in his expression faltered for just a second. "You really think this changes anything?" He gestured vaguely to the walls around them. "You think I'm the only one who plays the game this way? You think this system isn't still stacked against you? You took down one man, Carter. One. But the machine?" His lips curled, almost in amusement, but there was something hollow behind it now. "The machine keeps turning." Aaliyah was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned forward, resting her arms on the table, her eyes locking onto his with a steadiness that made his stomach drop. "You're right." Her voice was softer now, but not weak. Measured. Steady. "The machine does keep turning. But here's the thing about machines, Howard, they only work as long as people like you keep them running." She let that settle. He stared at her, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "So what now?" His voice was lower now, not as sure as before. "You ruin me. Make an example out of me." Aaliyah exhaled, tilting her head slightly. "You ruined yourself." Silence. For the first time, he had no response. She reached into the folder she had brought with her, sliding a sheet of paper across the table. "These are the terms of your cooperation," she said simply. "Testify. Give them every name you know. Every corrupt official, every backroom deal, every person who helped you keep your little empire running. In exchange, the sentencing recommendations will be less severe." Reynolds' eyes flickered to the paper, then back to her. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "And if I don't?" Aaliyah's lips barely moved, but the weight of her next words hit like a blade against his throat. "Then you die in a cage." His breath caught. Because for the first time since this had all begun, he realized she wasn't bluffing. The walls weren't just closing in. They were already locked in place. He looked down at the paper again, the ink swimming in front of his eyes. The weight of everything, the years of corruption, of arrogance, of believing he was untouchable, came crashing down all at once. His fingers twitched. A shaky breath. A decision waiting to be made. And Aaliyah Carter? She just watched. Silent. Unmoving. Waiting. The room felt impossibly small now, suffocating in a way that had nothing to do with its actual size. The walls seemed closer than before, pressing inward, the air thick and unrelenting, settling into every crevice, into the very fabric of the space, making it hard to breathe. The clock on the wall ticked at an agonizing pace, each second stretching into eternity, amplifying the unbearable weight of the silence that had taken hold. Howard Reynolds sat in his chair, shoulders tense, his hands gripping the edge of the metal table as if steadying himself against a force that threatened to pull him under. His gaze was fixed on the document in front of him, the words swimming together, blurring at the edges, his mind refusing to accept the reality they represented. Across from him, unmoving, unwavering, was Aaliyah Carter. The weight of her presence was just as oppressive as the silence in the room, her gaze sharp, patient, waiting. She didn't need to speak, didn't need to push, because the truth had already done its job, settling into Reynolds' chest like lead, heavy and immovable. His breath was uneven, shallow, his heartbeat an erratic drum in his ears, but he forced himself to straighten his posture, forced his expression into something that still resembled defiance, even though he knew, deep down, that any control he thought he had was slipping through his fingers like sand. He tried to hold on to the arrogance that had carried him for decades, the confidence that had once made him untouchable, but the cracks were too deep now, the fractures widening with every second that passed. His voice came out rough, unsteady, a shadow of what it once was. You think you've won? It wasn't really a question, nor was it an accusation, it was something else, something closer to desperation, a grasp at something that no longer existed. Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words, as if entertaining the thought before deciding whether or not they were even worth responding to. Her expression didn't change, her patience unfazed, her confidence unshaken. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, laced with something that wasn't quite amusement, but wasn't far from it either. Define winning. The simplicity of the response, the way she let the question linger between them, made something twist in his gut. His jaw clenched, and he shook his head, his grip on the table tightening, trying to hold on to some semblance of the power he had once wielded. You've ruined me. Congratulations. You took down one corrupt judge. But you think this will change anything? He gestured vaguely, his movements sharp, fueled by the frustration bubbling just beneath the surface, threatening to spill over. I've seen this before. You burn one man, and another takes his place. You think you're dismantling the system, but all you're doing is giving it time to adjust. It adapts. There was something bitter in his voice now, something resentful, but beneath it all, beneath the anger and the arrogance, there was fear. Aaliyah exhaled, slow and deliberate, her gaze never wavering. She had heard it all before, the excuses, the justifications, the rationalizations men like him clung to in order to convince themselves they were merely playing a role, that they weren't the problem, that they were just part of something bigger than themselves, something too vast to be undone. But she knew better. She leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on the table, her presence suffocating in a way that had nothing to do with proximity, her voice dropping just enough to make the weight of her words settle deeper into his bones. You're right, she said, letting the statement hang in the air for just a second longer than necessary. The system is built to survive. But you forgot one thing. Her eyes locked onto his, unrelenting, razor-sharp. It only survives as long as no one fights back. Something flickered in his expression, something that hadn't been there before, something that hadn't existed in him until this very moment. The fear was no longer just lingering beneath the surface, it was rising now, tangible, suffocating, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. The realization was settling in, wrapping itself around him like iron chains. He had lost. The fight was over, and no amount of scrambling, no amount of last-minute maneuvering, was going to change that. Silence stretched between them, heavy, thick, unrelenting. His fingers hovered over the paper in front of him, the confession that would seal his fate, the words that would turn him from a man in power to a man in disgrace. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, the finality of what he was about to do crushing him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, the sound barely audible. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. And what happens after I sign? Aaliyah didn't blink. She didn't hesitate. Her voice was steady, firm, as unshakable as the truth itself. You talk. His lips parted slightly, his breathing shallow, his pulse erratic. His mind raced, spinning through scenarios, searching desperately for an option that didn't lead him to this moment, but there was none. There was no way out. And if I don't? The question felt hollow, as if he already knew the answer but needed to hear it anyway, needed to have it spoken into existence so he could no longer pretend there was another choice. Her expression remained unreadable, but her next words cut through him with brutal precision. Then your trial moves forward. The evidence against you is airtight. They'll convict you, strip you of everything. You'll be alone, abandoned, left to rot in a cell while the same people you once protected move on without you. She let that settle, let it weigh on him, let it suffocate him. Then, she delivered the final blow. And if you think the people who helped you all these years will come to your defense, you're more delusional than I thought. His fingers trembled now, his hands barely steady as he hovered over the paper. The ink on the page blurred slightly, his vision narrowing, tunneling. He had been powerful once. He had been feared, respected, untouchable. But now? Now he was nothing. Just another man who thought himself invincible until reality came crashing down around him. His breath hitched. His fingers twitched. And then, finally, his hand moved. The pen scratched against the paper, the ink soaking into the fibers, sealing his fate in a single movement. The moment the signature was complete, something inside him cracked. His shoulders slumped. His grip on the pen loosened until it slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. He had fought, resisted, denied the truth, but in the end, it had caught up to him anyway. Aaliyah reached forward, taking the signed confession, slipping it back into the folder without a word. Her movements were smooth, efficient, final. She stood, straightening her posture, exuding the same quiet, unshakable authority she had walked in with. He didn't look at her. Couldn't. But before she turned to leave, her voice cut through the room one last time. "You asked me if I think I've won." A pause. A heartbeat stretched into eternity. She exhaled, her gaze sharp, cold, unyielding. "I don't need to win, Howard." She lifted the folder slightly. "I just need men like you to lose." And with that, she walked out. And Howard Reynolds? He was left staring at the wreckage of his own making, drowning in the realization that the world he had built had finally collapsed around him. The world moved forward without Howard Reynolds. His name, once spoken with authority, now lingered in the air like the last remnants of a burned-out flame. The scandal erupted like wildfire, tearing through headlines, dominating primetime news, and becoming the focal point of discussions about corruption within the judiciary. His face, once framed in dignity behind the grand mahogany desk of his courtroom, was now plastered across news broadcasts with words like disgraced, bribery, systemic misconduct, and federal indictment flashing beneath it. Every outlet dug deeper into his past, uncovering years of carefully hidden deception, a network of backroom deals, and the countless cases where justice had been bent to serve the highest bidder. The people he had once surrounded himself with, powerful lawyers, politicians, businessmen, had all turned their backs on him, distancing themselves from the sinking ship, unwilling to be dragged down with him. His phone, once a constant stream of favors, connections, and whispered assurances, had gone silent. The world had no more use for Howard Reynolds. His trial was swift, merciless in its efficiency. The evidence was damning, airtight, his confession the final nail in the coffin. He sat in the defendant's chair, stripped of the robes that once shielded him, forced to listen as prosecutors outlined his corruption piece by piece, his empire of deception crumbling before a jury of everyday citizens who had no sympathy for the man who had spent decades mocking the very laws he was supposed to uphold. His sentencing was met with a sense of finality, 25 years in a federal prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 15. The moment the gavel came down, sealing his fate, the last illusion of power he had clung to shattered. Prison was not kind to men like Howard Reynolds. A former judge, stripped of privilege, reduced to a numbered jumpsuit and a cot in a 6x9 cell. The same system he had manipulated now moved on without him, grinding forward, its gears adjusting to accommodate his absence. He was no longer important. No longer feared. No longer anything. And every night, as he lay on his thin mattress, staring up at the cracked ceiling of his cell, he understood, for the first time, what it truly meant to be powerless. Aaliyah Carter, however, was far from finished. The case against Reynolds was only the beginning. His fall had sparked something larger, a national conversation about judicial corruption, about the unchecked power of the men behind the benches, about the lives ruined by a system designed to protect the privileged. The Justice Department launched a sweeping investigation, unearthing a network of corrupt officials, leading to more arrests, more resignations, more doors blown open that had been locked for far too long. And Aaliyah? She didn't slow down. Her career soared in the aftermath, but it was never about the recognition, never about the applause. It was about the fight. About making sure no one like Howard Reynolds ever sat in unchecked power again. She continued dismantling the foundations of injustice, exposing corruption wherever it lurked, proving that even the most fortified walls could be torn down if you were willing to strike hard enough. Her reputation became something more than just respected, it became feared by those who had something to hide. Nathaniel Porter, the man whose case had been laughed out of Reynolds' courtroom, finally got his justice. With the judge who dismissed his case now disgraced and his firm exposed for its discriminatory practices, Nathaniel's name was cleared, his legal battle revived with overwhelming public support. This time, he didn't just win, he set a precedent. His case became a landmark decision, shifting policies on workplace discrimination, forcing corporations to be held accountable in ways they never had before. And when he was offered a partnership at a firm that truly valued him, he accepted, but not before ensuring that part of his contract included a diversity initiative that would prevent another black lawyer from being shut out of the system the way he had been. Justice had been served. But justice wasn't the same as peace. Aaliyah knew that. She stood in her office late one evening, staring out at the city, the skyline illuminated by the glow of streetlights and windows. The fight never really ended. There would always be another Reynolds, another case, another battle waiting to be fought. She had accepted that a long time ago. What mattered wasn't winning, it was making sure the fight never stopped. She glanced at her phone. Another case. Another lead. Another name waiting to be crossed off the list. She took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and then she picked up the phone and got to work. And just like that, the machine that had once tried to silence her found itself being dismantled, piece by piece, case by case, name by name. Now, let's talk about power. This story isn't just about one corrupt judge. It's about the systems that protect them. It's about how power is rarely taken from the powerful, it has to be fought for, demanded, torn from the hands of those who believe they own it. Howard Reynolds didn't fall because he made a mistake. He fell because someone finally refused to let him get away with it. How many times have we seen injustice in our own lives? How many times have we been told that speaking up won't change anything, that the system is too strong, that corruption is just the way things are? But here's the truth, it only stays that way if no one fights back. Aaliyah Carter didn't bring down Howard Reynolds overnight. It took patience. It took persistence. It took knowing that real change doesn't come from a single battle, but from a war fought in small, deliberate strikes. So let me ask you, who are the Howard Reynolds in your world? The bosses who use their power to silence others? The officials who think they're above the law? The people who laugh in the face of justice, certain they'll never face consequences? What would happen if they were finally held accountable? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. Let's keep the conversation going. And if you want more stories like this, stories that expose power, twist expectations, and remind us that justice isn't just an idea but something that has to be fought for, then make sure you subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because the fight isn't over. And neither are the stories.